We were looking at companies that had been able to transform themselves multiple times, because Intel had to do that too, transforming itself from a semiconductor memory company to a microprocessor company. And Grove at the time was the CEO of the company that was now Intel, the microprocessor company. And so we looked around and we said, well, we have one close by. HP has been able to transform itself 4 or 5 times in its history up to the mid-90s. And so then by the late 90s, when Carly Fiorina became the CEO, Andy and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we now wrote a new case about HP and track over time how the new CEO is going to try to, bring the company to the next level of performance. And so I did that. So I got to know Ms. Fiorina and wrote case studies, and then I got to know Mr. Hur, who followed her, and I was able to write some case study as well. And so I continue to be interested in trying to understand what is it at HP that allowed it to do these multiple transformations, and try to come up with explanations that would go beyond just that it was the result of luck or some random process, or just the fact that in place were some external factors that made it possible for that company to continue to exist, sort of almost independent of who was running it. So that's why I focused on HP. First of all, no board of directors, even a dysfunctional one, will want to hire a CEO that they believe is incompetent and badly intentioned. So we must assume, the null hypothesis would be that boards of directors always try to appoint people that they believe are competent and well-intentioned. I think that's a reasonable. Yet it turns out that these people sometimes end up doing things that in retrospect may not have looked as the wisest or the best. And so that's kind of interesting. It would not be interesting if we could assume that boards of directors just appoint anybody, dummies as much as smart people. So that's one thing. And I find that interesting. How do we learn from the activities of people that we must assume were pretty smart to begin with, and that may nevertheless end up with less positive consequences? That's one thing. And the second thing is, in some ways, I think, in some ways at least equally important, maybe even more, is that I try to adopt an empathic approach based on my belief that every CEO who comes in is well-intentioned and reasonably smart, right? And then try to understand that, in fact, the performance of every CEO, except maybe the founders, is actually cannot fully be understood in terms of the actions that they took themselves, because they are dealt a hand that includes all the challenges left over by their predecessor. And in turn, they will solve some of these challenges, but they will leave some others for the next CEO. So for instance, in the case of HP, if you want to try to understand the performance, the financial performance, for instance, of the company, the stock market valuation of the company, if you were only to look at the period that someone was CEO and attribute the market performance only to that CEO, you would be missing a very important piece, I think. So those are two things, to try to understand, why do very smart people end up doing things that may or may not be so smart? And secondly, how do we try to get a better understanding about the time interdependency of performance of CEOs in long-lived companies? One of the insights that I propose is that messy beats perfection. Now, that sounds a little bit, it's almost like, it sounds almost a little bit simplistic, but the underlying rationale for that is actually reasonably, it is reasonably profound. And the reason is as follows. So if you look at HP that we have been discussing, HP really has never been a completely dominant player in the industries in which it has been. Printing came close, but never fully. So as a result, HP always has been struggling and always has been looking for something to make a contribution, because David Packard had three principles, right? Maybe I should say that. One was, we always want to make a contribution, right, to our customers. And that contribution has to be big enough that it creates enough value that the shareholders will want the company to continue to be independent. Right? Those are the two key things. The second thing that he basically put forth is we want to focus on external competition, not internal competition. And the third thing was we want to find new areas of technology where we can make that contribution. That's the three principles, and I've tried to examine throughout all these CEOs to what extent did they adhere to those principles. There was also yet something really interesting that late in his career David Packard came up with, and that created consternation within the company. He cited a poem that is called, a 19th century poem called the One-Horse Shay. Nobody knows what a one-horse shay really means, I didn't either. But it means it was the one-horse cart that was perfectly designed that it would continue to exist for 100 years. But at the time that it reached 100 years, it would explode in thousands of pieces. And I think what Packard was trying to say was, that's not what I want HP to be. We don't want it to be a one-horse shay. Now, so therefore, what is the link? Well, some companies become like one-horse shays because they become locked in with the environment in which they operate, and they become very dominant in that environment. But by being so dominant, they must also do more and more to stay dominant, and thereby they become very specialized to that industry. One of the reasons why I believe that HP is a long-lived organization company is that it has actually been, I would say, lived in an ongoing way in a situation that's messy rather than perfect. And by perfect I mean it has never become so dominant in any given environment, product market environment, that it became so dominant that it had to actually continue to do things to stay dominant in that environment, became locked in with it, and specialized to it, and thereby lost its capacity to evolve, which is to find new areas in which it could be successful, as opposed to staying in this one area and basically become locked in with it and have no escape from that prison.